And now let's take a look at other stories and shift our focus to the European Union, the torch-bearer of climate activism. Or should I say climate change hypocrisy? We've dwelled on this several times and now we have another reason to. Look at this report. It says that in the last 9 years, big polluting industries have been granted more than 100 billion euros in free carbon permits by the European Union. A carbon permit is basically a credit of sorts which can be purchased by companies to make up for their CO2 emissions. In other words, you pay money in the form of damages and get your CO2 emissions off the charts. Basically, a free pass to pollute and not be accountable. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The European Union is helping it thrive. I'm not saying this, surveys are. They show how the EU is giving free allowances to the big polluters instead of letting them buy it. These permits didn't come with any climate conditions attached, like increasing energy efficiency or switching to renewables. The polluters face no such obligations. Now look at this graph. It tells you how many carbon permits the EU has sold and how many free carbon permits it has granted. The difference between the two is stark and wide. Since 2019, the EU has granted way too many free carbon permits than the number of carbon permits bought by industries. It doesn't end there. The EU has an emissions trading scheme, ETS. It's basically a scheme to charge polluters for CO2 emissions from coal and gas stations. The EU calls it a cornerstone of its policy to combat climate change. But is it really? The report says a third of the revenue raised from the ETS was never spent on climate action plans. So where then did the money go? To the EU's coffers. According to the report, between 2013 and 2021, more than 25 billion euros in ETS revenue went straight into the coffers of EU nations. 25 billion euros. That's not all. Another 12 billion euros raised in ETS revenue was spent on setting up new fossil fuel infrastructure. Where exactly was this new infrastructure set up? In countries like Germany, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic and Croatia. They all received climate change revenue only to set up more climate-threatening projects. These are some explosive revelations, but they're hardly surprising. Since time immemorial, the EU has put up a facade of trying to protect the environment, only to violate its own climate pledges. I'll start with this report. It came out in 2021. It said Europe's 25 biggest banks provided $55 billion to new oil and gas projects in 2021. The biggest European provider of fossil finance was HSBC, which is not only one of the biggest banks in all of Europe, it apparently pumped out $8.7 billion into oil and gas expansion. The money went to companies like ExxonMobil and Saudi Aramco. This happened last year, the same year when EU leaders pledged to improve their emissions at COP26. Do you know what became of those pledges? They all ended up stuck in red tape and ignorance. According to one report, more than 200 countries and regions agreed to cut emissions at COP26. A year on, only 24 countries have done so. And no, they're not from Europe. Most of these countries are from Asia. This is hypocrisy at its finest, especially if you look at Europe's history. Since the 18th century onwards, Europe burnt coal and other fossil fuel to develop its economy and get richer. It emitted a lot of greenhouse gases in the process. Over the decades, these gases changed our climate. The rest of the world started using the fuels too. Climate change became bigger, life-threatening. Now the world needs to clean up, but the responsibility for the cleanup is not being evenly shared. The blame is largely being put on the developing world, as Western countries, which are historically, morally, politically, and perhaps even financially responsible for climate change, now paint themselves as green. My point is simple. Industrialized nations grew at the ecological expense of developing countries. They became rich and very smartly de-industrialized later and exported their carbon emissions. Now they preach the world on cutting emissions, but can't even stick to their own pledges. Just think about that.
WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.